Good afternoon and welcome to Bioethics Grand Rounds, sponsored by the Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences in Medicine here at the University of Michigan Medical School. I'm Dr. Andy Schumann and one of the co-chairs of the Clinical Ethics Service. It is a privilege and a pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Scott Stonington is an MD PhD who is dual trained in internal medicine and anthropology. He currently serves as an associate professor of anthropology, international studies, as well as internal medicine here at the University of Michigan. He has a practice both in primary care and hospital medicine in Southeast Michigan at the University of Michigan, as well as at the Veterans Affairs Hospital here in Ann Arbor. He is also a member of the Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences in Medicine. He's the author of The Spirit Ambulance, Choreographing the End of Life in Thailand, which explores changes in the experience of end of life resulting from globalization of biomedical technologies and bioethics. He really does work at the nexus of anthropology, medicine, and ethics. He's the first lead editor of the New England Journal of Medicine series on case studies in social medicine, which looks at social sciences and its impact upon clinicians and patients. His current projects address pain management in Thailand and clinical communication between patients and their providers in Peru. It is my privilege and pleasure to welcome him today. Please, if you have questions, comments, or would like to share something, use the Q&A and chat feature of the webinar, and we would be happy to have a moderated discussion of those towards the end of the talk. Without further ado, Dr. Stonington, welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for having me. I love this venue, and I'm just I have been an enthusiastic member of the center for so long, so I'm happy to get a chance to share a little bit with you all. And in thinking about what topic to do for this Grand Rounds, I had in front of me a range of possibilities, and I decided that we're all in this era of Zoom fatigue and a form of engagement where I think we're having a hard time paying attention to things, honestly. So I decided, rather than doing some of the really clinically applied ethical things that come out of my work, that I would do something that was going to be conceptually stimulating and vivid and interesting, to give us a slightly different lens on what we do every day in clinical bioethics. And so you can tell from the slightly abstract title of my talk, Bioethics and the Entangled Self, that hopefully we're going to be on a journey into some mind-bending material. But I do want to say that this book that I wrote that came out a year and a half ago, called The Spirit Ambulance, actually has a lot of very clinically relevant bioethical questions in it. It is a kind of journey that I went on in Thailand that was ultimately a series of hugely surprising moments that I then am able to explain why they were surprising to me based on my training in Western bioethics, and how they make sense in the choreographing or the making of a good death in Thailand, in a very different place. So if you're, well, maybe at the end we can talk about some of those more clinically relevant, although we'll get to some clinical relevance in this talk. But part of what I want to do today is take an old familiar component of ethical theory in both philosophy and the social sciences and in clinical bioethics in the West, which is the sanctity of and importance of the individual and the ability for the individual in situations to make decisions and exercise autonomy, etc. And don't worry, for those of you who are bored with the old punching bag of autonomy in Western bioethics, which is sort of an easy straw person to pick on. But I think you'll see that today we're going to do something a little bit different with it. We'll get to the ethical, philosophical, and applied stuff a little bit later. But first, I want to just take you into a journey into the world that we'll be talking about in Thailand. And I want to start out with something quite abstract, actually, from religious studies, which is a concept about what the relationship in a particular space or meaning-oriented world or religion, what the relationship is between the material world and the immaterial world. And I'm going to borrow a concept here from religious studies, which goes under the banner of the term transduction of form, which is really just ultra academic way of saying that in many world religions, the metaphysical world governs how the material and the immaterial become one another. So what on earth do I mean by that? If any of you all have visited Thailand, often people who even are just tourists in Thailand will visit temples. And there are these very prominent images you see in temples of these big gold Buddhas and or huge bells and these large forms that are what people mostly notice about religious practice. And there is an object that often goes unnoticed, which are these little white threads that connect objects within temples in Thailand. In Thai Buddhism, there is a notion of spiritual power as this thing, this object that is partly material and partly immaterial, and that can be transferred between objects or between places in the world. And this spiritual power is generated through ethical activity, through moral action. So the classic form of this is that monks sit and meditate or chant, and this is an activity that generates goodness overall for the world. It is a kind of immaterial material thing that gets created through ethical activity. And these white threads, which in Thai are called saisin, are, my Thai friends describe them as something sort of like electric wires for spiritual power. So in a Thai temple, people will be meditating or chanting, and then they have these white threads that connect their bodies and the actions that they are performing to other objects in the temple. And you can see here in an image on the right that the threads all accumulate in this Buddha statue, which develops this kind of residue of spiritual power that accumulates over time, that then people can interact with, and they can ask for blessings and touch the statue and receive luck and spiritual inspiration, etc. So you're probably wondering, why on earth am I telling you about this super abstract thing? The reason is because in Thailand, this process of transduction between material and immaterial forms has gotten completely entangled in the practice of modern biomedical hospital medicine. And so the place I'm going to take you to understand this is in the north of Thailand, in a city called Chiang Mai, that is a huge urban metropolis that's also surrounded by these beautiful rice fields and rolling mountains that go up into the Golden Triangle. And the reason that I went particularly to Chiang Mai for this research is that we didn't really explain this much at the outset, but I'll share that I have an MD and a PhD. So I did a combined training program where I did both medical school, but sort of tacking back and forth between medical school and a PhD in anthropology. And in medical school, I had a set of patients who were in the intensive care unit, and who described to me how being in the ICU was this sort of sudden, shocking experience of a kind of cybernetic modern life where they were so intimately entangled with these machines that they had started to not really understand where their life ended and the machines began, especially when they were on mechanical ventilation or other things that were really keeping them alive. So when I wanted to do my anthropology fieldwork, I was curious about that kind of clash of sudden experiences of intensive care medicine. And so I picked Thailand partly because Thailand has a universal healthcare system that is incredibly comprehensive. It is so effective that it's absolutely embarrassing for us how good their medical care system is, because they spend about 1/20th of the GDP on it that we do, and most of their public health outcomes are much better than ours in the United States. But the universal health system in Thailand has a special feature that drew me to it, which is that people over the last 20 years have now developed access to intensive care medicine essentially for everybody in the country. So it's a pretty rare example of a middle income or a low middle income country where everybody has access to end of life care. And the reason that that is a useful experiment is because it gives a sense of a place where the rule rather than the exception is this kind of trope of sudden, modern, super high-tech medicine experiences. And the reason I'm going to tell you about this today, and don't worry, we'll get back to our ethical concepts, especially about autonomy and individuality. But the reason I want to tell you about it today is because the ICU in particular has gotten entangled in a kind of transduction of form that has implicated medical practice by physicians and nurses in a kind of dance back and forth between the physical and the metaphysical, the material and the immaterial. The way that people explain this to me, and this is kind of a first approach, although we'll get to other versions of it, is that children owe their parents a debt of life for having been given a body at birth. And the first family that I followed or took care of in the ICU in Thailand, when they explained this idea to me, I hadn't even heard this phrase, a debt of life. And it came up essentially the very first patient that I took care of in the ICU, because this set of daughters who were there taking care of their father who was in the ICU had just received the news that he was unlikely to survive from the multiple organ failure that he had gone into. And I asked them, do you have any thought of ending this treatment that he's getting in the ICU? And they said, never, we won't end this until we can't do it anymore. And the reason is because we owe our father a debt of life and we are paying it back in the hospital. And when I looked confused, they took out a piece of paper and they drew me the table that I'm showing you on the screen, where they divided the body up into its component elements, which map onto the different elements of matter in a Vedic system that is true sort of for Indian Vedic systems and Buddhist Vedic systems in Southeast Asia, that divides the material world into earth, air, fire, and water. And they divided his body up into corresponding components of life objects, which were flesh, blood, breath, and warmth. They didn't put warmth in their table to describe it to me. But they were able to then tell me in very concrete detail each of the technologies of the ICU that they were using to pay back components of their elder's body that they had received when they had been given a body at birth. And, this may sound, for those of you who, have read about bioethics in different parts of the world, there is a notion of an intense form of family indebtedness that is very prevalent throughout lots of East Asia. With terms attached to it like familial piety, in which a lot of the sort of worship systems of families are related to one's ancestors. But this kind of debt was very surprising to me when I first saw it, because it was so physical and material and biological and bodily. This was not we love our father because he took care of us and we need to take care of him back. It was that a body was given to the children at the moment of birth, and the body itself contained this kind of spiritual power that incurred a debt that needed to be paid back in a similar form. Okay, so the ICU has gotten entangled in a ethical logic that relies on and transduction between the material and the immaterial, and that privileges the human body as a particularly powerful site where the immaterial and the material meet. So people talk about how they used to pay back this debt of life in villages, at home, with caregiving and food and dressing of wounds and herbal medications. But as Thailand has hyper-technologized its healthcare system in the last 20, 30, 40 years, that debt of life has shifted to the ICU. So now people need to get their elders to the hospital as the sort of most supercharged place to pay back this debt of life. At the same time, dying in the hospital is a very bad idea. And the reason is because hospitals are haunted by unhappy spirits, ghosts. And ghosts are generated by unexpected or any kind of bad death that leaves the dying person with unfinished business with the living world, that they then, rather than being reborn in a clean and free way, as is hoped for in this reincarnation system that is core to Thai Buddhism, instead of being reborn, it creates this intermediary period where they stick around to try to embroil the living in resolving their unresolved business. And this photograph that I'm showing you here is actually a picture that was shown to me by a fellow medical student in Thailand. I was doing a med school rotation and I was going out to a rural hospital, and one of my fellow med students said, "Are you scared?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I'm scared. I'm going to go try practicing medicine in Thai, which is just sort of a bad idea." And he said, "No, are you scared of ghosts?" And he pulled out his laptop and showed me this photograph, which turns out is actually sort of a doctored up image from a poster for a horror film in Thailand. And for anybody who is in the audience who's interested in actually sort of like bioethically inflected cinema, Thailand has all of this really interesting film, and a lot of it has some of these themes that we'll be talking about today. But their most famous cinema is all ghost movies, which are terrifying and really interesting. And every ghost movie has a scene in a hospital because that's where bad deaths happen that generate these unhappy, sort of hungry spirits. And also, by the way, in these films, the first victim of the ghosts is always the medical intern, who represents Western rationality and an inability to sort of have an intuition about and respect the metaphysical part of this transduction of form. So we need to get to the hospital to pay back this debt of life, but dying in the hospital is a terrible idea. Dying at home, on the other hand, is the home is an excellent place to die. And it's an excellent place to die for all of the opposite reasons, or the same reasons, but the opposite outcome of the hospital, which is that the home, it hasn't had any bad deaths in it. And in fact, it's had the opposite of that. It has had a lifetime or many lifetimes lived, engaged in beautiful and loving and moral activity, the things that people in sort of recently have recognized as the underappreciated and or sort of silenced feminine side of Buddhism, where the world of religious studies has always studied the very masculine side of monks who are meditating in monasteries. And but there's a huge amount of spiritual power generated in Thailand around the activities of daily life that are also morally inflected activities: making food, raising children, giving birth, creating marriages that are good and ethics. So all the ethics and morality of daily life, it accumulates in the home as a space. And so this is a woman that I'm showing you who was in the ICU for a while. And then I followed her in my research. I wrote the end of life stories of a whole bunch of people that I recruited into my study. So I had met this woman in the hospital. And here she is now, after coming home from the hospital, on the floor of the living room of her house. And around the head of her bed, I'm hoping you all can see my cursor here, around the head of her bed are bags full of all of her favorite possessions. And they are, the possessions are there so that at the moment of death, she doesn't miss anything that would make her cling to this world. She doesn't wonder where anything is. And the job of everyone in her social world, as you can see gathered around her bed here on the living room floor, the job of everyone in her social world is to just be present so that they also aren't missed at the moment of death. And the family around the clock on this kind of deathbed vigil, the family cooks the most fabulous food you've ever eaten, and they keep it flowing all the time so that everyone from the village is cycling through. I didn't include the photo in this talk, but right where I'm taking this photograph, if you turn around, there's a very large veranda to this house that is just full of gathered people eating delicious food so that they are there and not missed. So if we need to get people to the hospital to pay back this debt of life, but then we need to get them home before they die, despite having been in the intensive care unit, on life support, on machines that have kept their body alive past death so that their body is actually already in a way dead, or it is on its way beyond the processes that normally would have killed it. we need to take them off life support in the intensive care unit and get them home so that their spirit can separate from the body in the right place. This sets up this wild, urgent cultural strategy that people call the spirit ambulance. And it's an ambulance not to get the person's body to a location where it will survive, but instead to get the person's spirit home so that it can separate from the body in the right kind of atmosphere. So the spirit ambulance where I did my field work was a public hospital where I was working. And so most people didn't have the finances to hire an actual ambulance with nursing staff, et cetera. So the spirit ambulance was a side business run by the hospital gate guard. The hospital had sort of this place where you would drive up, and it had an arm that would go up and down before you could drive into the parking lot with a greeter who gave you information about the hospital, et cetera. And this guy, who you can see in this photograph in his jacket in the cold season here in Thailand, ran a side business where he would get alerted by cell phone by the nurses from the intensive care unit, and he would pull his pickup truck around the back entrance of the hospital right next to the ICU. And we would take patients off of their mechanical ventilator and put them on an ambu bag for bag ventilation. And we would load them into this pickup truck so that we could drive them home. And he had outfitted his pickup truck with a mattress and 2 oxygen tanks. And you can see in this photograph that, I don't know if it comes through Zoom, but there's this little hook at the top of his pickup truck cabin where we could hang any IV medications that were sort of survival necessary, like pressors, et cetera, to keep the blood pressure up and the heart beating. And we would load people into this, into the back of the truck for the journey home. And the spirit ambulance driver had learned through his own experience and observations, and also through a set of study with monks who were experts in the metaphysical process and physical process of dying in Thai Buddhism. And he had discovered that the thing that makes a spirit separate from the body is that when the body starts to the process of decaying, it suddenly becomes an inhospitable environment that the spirit wants to separate itself from. So he had figured out that if somebody were to die on the way in this journey, he had jerry-rigged an embalming apparatus out of a motorcycle tire pump and a high school chemistry beaker set. And we would go on the spirit ambulance from driving at breakneck speeds, breaking all the speed limits, swerving through traffic to try to make it home, with people in the back of the cabin, either the family or, when I was there as a medical student and an anthropology graduate student, I was recruited as the most medical person around. So my job was to keep the pulse of the person and bag ventilate them to keep their spirit attached to their body. And if they were to die on the way, we would suddenly slow down and pull over on the side of the road. And he would use this motorcycle tire needle to cannulate a large vessel in the neck or the groin of the patient, and then use the motorcycle tire pump to pump them full of embalming fluid to slow the decay process so that the spirit wouldn't separate from the body on the way and get lost in an unknown metaphysical environment. And then we would go from driving really fast to suddenly driving very slowly and talking the spirit into knowing where it was and knowing that it was close to its body so that it could make it home. And people would say things that the more specific, the better, so that the spirit would know what was happening. Like, we're passing the 7-Eleven where you used to buy your cigarettes, and we're passing the schoolyard where you used to get beat up as a kid. The more specific and the more vivid and the more emotional the details, the more the spirit could feel connected to the reality of its life and of the body and make it home. And then we would eventually make it to their home. And this is a picture of a house of a woman who lived way out in the rural areas in outside of Chiang Mai. And this house was what normally would have been a 5.5-hour drive from the city hospital where we were. But on this spirit ambulance journey, we made it in 3 hours, and I vomited off the back of the truck because I was so car sick because we were winding through these wild mountain roads. We arrived home, and the whole community had been alerted by cell phone that we were arriving. And this is actually a photograph I took of the house the next day because I had to sleep there. But when we had arrived, that opening in the house was full of people's heads who were waiting for this this woman to arrive. And we picked her up on the mattress and carried her into the house. And people had prepared, even though they were suspecting that she was going to die quickly, they had prepared quick versions of a whole series of formal and informal rituals designed to get her to let go of the sticky stuff that might keep her attached to this world. Forgiveness ceremonies where people asked her for forgiveness for wrongs that they had done to her, and vice versa. And people had prepared bites of her favorite food and things that they wanted to say to her. And on this occasion, they did all of that very quickly. And then the family members said, okay, it's time to remove the endotracheal tube. And for reasons I won't explain now, I was nervous about doing that because that is actually considered active euthanasia in Thailand rather than passive euthanasia. And if anybody's curious about that, I can explain more about that. So I was nervous about doing that, even though they asked me to do it. So the hospital gate guard who ran the spirit ambulance did it instead because it was part of his services he offered as part of the spirit ambulance, was this extubation. And in this case, the woman woke up and she coughed up a bunch of blood, and then she looked at everybody in her environment and had all these interactions, and then she passed away. And all of that was considered a very good death, an elaborately choreographed and very complicated journey to the hospital and return home, but that had achieved all of this kind of ethical, moral work that needed to get done at the end of life. So why on earth did I tell you this whole long story? You must be thinking we are so away from the thing I told you I was going to talk about, which is some of these sort of core bioethical concepts. But I hope that you noticed along the way in this story that I was telling you about a situation in which high-tech, super actually cutting edge biomedical practice had gotten completely entangled in this ethically necessary transduction between the material and the immaterial world, where there were these physical bodies that kids had received from their parents that had created this ethical moral debt that they then had to pay back in the form of these life objects. And medicine, including medical expertise, had gotten completely caught up in this, such that the nurses who ultimately made the decision about when somebody should be taken off life support to make it home, part of their clinical calculation was, if we take somebody off life support, how long are they likely to survive? And is that timing going to work with the spirit ambulance and getting their spirit into the right place for its optimal rebirth? But I want to take this a little bit further today. And this is where we're actually going to use this conceptual material to start questioning some of the deep concepts that we rely on in Western bioethics, to talk about a form of this entanglement between material and immaterial that goes even deeper beyond just this choreographing of situations and into our ideas of what make up individual people themselves. And this is a concept from the social sciences known as complex personhood that I'll tell you about in a bit. So I'm just going to start this actually with a story, and I'll get to why there's a buffalo on the screen in a little bit, so don't worry. I met this man in my research named Mahu, and he had invasive rectal cancer. And I thought of this as probably one of the most painful things I could think of, because I had actually heard them talking about his CAT scans, and the tumor had invaded a whole bunch of adjacent structures in his pelvis, and it just sounded absolutely torturous. But Mahu, this old guy, he was in his late 70s, he was this totally jolly, happy guy. And I got a chance to ask him, you have this very severe illness that I think of as really painful. How are you coping with it so well? And he said, The reason that I'm coping with it is because my illness is my karma master. And again, this was a new word to me. So I made him, this is my translation, karma master. It's this word in Thai. I can tell you about the roots of it if anybody's curious. It's called Jiao Gum Nai Wang. And so I asked him to explain what it was. And he said, last month, when I was first in the hospital for this illness, actually, I'll start the story at a different place. He actually started by saying, my whole life, I was a buffalo farmer. So here's where we get to the buffalo on the screen. And I leashed buffaloes by putting a ring through their nose and pulling on it, and it was really painful, pulling on it, and they would go where I needed them to go and do what I needed them to do. And then last month, when I was first hospitalized for this illness, I had a tube in my nose. And it turns out he was talking about a nasogastric tube and a nasal cannula. He said I had a tube in my nose, and every time I turned my head, it yanked on my nose, just like I used to yank on the buffalo. Because of that, I know that this illness is an old debt. It's an old karma. It's an old consequence. I'm just giving you different translations of the same thing he said. That I know that I mistreated these buffalo in the past. And so this tube is the buffalo who have come back to extract a kind of punishment from me that can work out this old relationship that we had. So this illness is my opportunity to right an old wrong and to now finally treat these buffalo well and ask for their forgiveness and resolve this old sticky business that grew up between us because of what I did. And he said, and also I used to ride the buffalo like 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, my whole life. And now my legs are bent. And he stood up where we were doing this interview, and his legs were bent to get sort of like a closed parenthesis. And he said, and now my hips hurt and my back hurt. That's how I know, and I want you to pay attention to this slip of language that he used. That's how I know that the buffalo are in my body and my legs are now part buffalo. Okay, I'm going to pause for a moment and tell you another story, but I want you to just hear that phrase about the buffalo. The buffalo live in the nasogastric tube and the nasal cannula and in his legs. So I met another man who I recruited into my research because he had a paralyzed and very painful right arm. And when I first met him, I asked him to explain what had happened with his arm, and I expected him to tell me about the accident that had generated this, what was ultimately like a really severe brachial plexopathy. And instead, he started his story many, many years ago when he was a kid. And he said, when I was young, I was super charming and popular and handsome, and all the girls wanted to date me. And I was a kid in this gang in my neighborhood where we would roam around and do all these pranks and practical tricks. And one of the tricks that I liked to do that made everybody laugh is I would take one of the stray dogs in our neighborhood and I would pull it onto my motorcycle. And I would ride the dog around and it would squeal and everybody thought it was funny and would laugh, until one day when the trick went wrong. And I was going faster than I had before, and I banked around a turn, and the dog slipped off of my motorcycle. And it landed on the ground, and it yelped in what was clearly a ton of pain, and it limped away. And then we didn't ever see the dog in the neighborhood again. And then years later, about 2 years before I was interviewing him, and he was now in his 30s, and he had really calmed down and become this sort of responsible guy. Years later, he said, I was driving along a mountain road at night, and I had been drinking just a little bit, but more than that, was sort of a brewing storm, and there was all of this fog, and I couldn't see where I was going very well. And again, I was banking around a turn, probably a little too fast. And a dog ran out of the forest, and I swerved to miss the dog, and I hooked my tire on the edge of the road, and I went down and I landed on my neck, and I slid across the pavement, and the pavement pulled my shoulder from my head. And I came to a stop in the trees on the side of the road. Slowly, I noticed that I couldn't move my arm, and that my arm had this horrible pain in it. And I lay there all night listening to the braying of dogs, of some pack of dogs in the woods all night until it was daytime and I could flag somebody down to help me. That is how I know that this pain I have in my arm is partly that dog. It's a different version of the dog than I had met long ago when I was a kid. But somehow some of that dog nature had come forward into the dog that ran out and trapped me overnight or made me fall on this motorcycle ride. And now I have these dreams where the dog is either chewing on my arm from the outside, or the dog is actually inside my arm, like it's part of my shoulder and it's chewing its way through my arm from the inside. And that's how I know that my arm is part dog. Okay. You must be, I mean, for a bioethics audience, people must be like, wow, where have we gone? What are we doing right now? We are so far from our bioethics consults in the hospital. But don't worry, we're coming back. I've told you about this because of what the question that I want to ask, that's sort of just a provocative thing to throw out there, is how do you make sense of ethical action and ethical frameworks in a setting where each individual is so entangled with other people that they're either embroiled in these complicated choreographies where it's not clear what individual action is, because they're doing what they're doing partly because they're paying back a debt of life to somebody else that was incurred by receiving a body from them, that is given back by giving them another piece of a body. And there's all this transfer of stuff that we might associate with the self that in a Western Christian monotheistic framework would be invested all and contained within a single soul or a transcendental self. But what happens when people are all entangled with each other? And then what happens when we take it extreme in this way I'm telling you about with the karma masters, where people are talking about their own bodies, their own selves are partly these hybrids of other organisms that they've become entangled with due to their own moral actions in the past. So how do you make sense of ethics when the individual starts to fall apart like this? And the thing I'll say that is obviously super oversimplifying, but I think is worth it for our conversation, is that Western ethical theory is totally dependent on bounded and self-contained individuals. Yes, people interact in social worlds and they love and or hate and are dependent on one another in various ways, but ultimately each person makes their own decisions. And even though we have frameworks about that are quite different from one another, each of them is ultimately about the individual. There is virtue ethics that we get from the Greeks, which is about how does a person practice and train over time to become a virtuous person who can then deal with whatever situation comes along because they have created a self that is righteous and will approach those problems in a good way. Or if we take our Enlightenment ethics and talk about individual interests and values and how people then in a collective space need to advocate for what they think is right and make decisions based on what is right for them relative to and often in conflict with other people. All of our ethical systems are really attached to this idea of the bounded individual. So if I start to answer this question with this field work, and this is where we're going to get to some more applied stuff about how to deal with situations where people are really entangled with one another. The idea that people talk about in Thailand is there's a very specific concept that people use, which is that rather than ethical action being about individuals making decisions, what ethical action is about is trying to assemble all of the right elements into a particular scene where some ethical event, like someone dying or making a medical decision, will take place. The story I told you about this debt of life and needing to do it in the hospital and then needing to get home and then the elaborate and complicated spirit ambulance strategy to make that happen. And then these stories of the people telling us about their karma masters. What they are doing as they approach their end of life is they are trying to take the ensemble of elements of creatures that make up the scene where their death will be, and make that whole ensemble as good as possible. So some of that involves fleeing places with a lot of polluting bad elements, like the hospital where there are these haunting, hungry ghosts, where you're probably not going to fix all of those ghosts right before you die so that your environment will be full of positive elements. So just get out of there and get to home, which is inhabited by all of these positive elements. But then there will be things that you can't escape or you can't get rid of, because due to your own actions in the past, you are so entangled with them, like the buffalo or the dog that are part of your body. And we'll get into a moment into what it's like to have things be part of your own mind. So those things, if you can't get away from them, all you can do is resolve that old karma, that ancient sticky business that has resolved, that has entangled you, and make that relationship good again. So it is a space that is full of very clear ethical action that doesn't require a sense of individuals and their values and interests and decisions to move forward. So the last thing I'll do to kind of give you a sense of this is tell you a story about something that's a little less bodily and a little more mind. Sometimes we say, okay, but so there's a dog in your arm. Is that really you? And so in my fieldwork, I met this man who I call, my pseudonym for him is Tot. And we were actually at a meditation retreat together. And we were roommates, so I got to know him well. And eventually, once he learned about my work and got to know me better, he started to reveal more about his life. And he told me that since he had been a sort of late teenager, he had suffered from what he called mild schizophrenia that was very well controlled on low-dose antipsychotics and just wasn't a big problem in his life. And I sort of took that information from him and just listened and then moved on. And then a little bit later in our friendship, he said, okay, because of what you're studying, I'm going to tell you what the real story of what is going on with the voices in my head. And the real story is that I in a past life, I murdered someone. And it was an act that was so evil that it took part of his self and fused it with me. And so that the voices that are in my head are actually his voices. And I had gotten far enough in my field work around this stuff that I knew enough to be really confused by all of this. And here was somebody who was, pretty educated and pretty sort of abstract philosophical thinker. And I said, okay, I'm going to ask you my real question about all this. How do you know that they're his voices and not your voices, or are they your voices? Who's who in there? And he said, you know what? In Buddhism, there's this whole long teaching about impermanence and the non-existence of the self that I could use to explain the fact that it doesn't even really matter, because neither my thoughts nor these other voices are really mine ultimately anyway. But the main thing is that it doesn't really matter if they're his thoughts or my thoughts, because all I have to do is act well toward myself and toward him, which means when these voices come up, I ask them for forgiveness. I forgive them for what they are doing to me. And I actually spend a lot of my meditation practice practicing loving kindness and sending love to these voices and to myself and to how I'm coping with these voices, etc. So it doesn't really matter who is whom. In any constellation of people, everyone involved who is making any decisions or is able to do any thinking, they just all together have to head the same direction towards right action, which in this case is always formulated as forgiveness, letting go, loving, and kindness. Okay, that talk today, that's the end of my slides. I thought I would just do this as a way to throw out a bunch of really hopefully stimulating conceptual material to push on some of what we have learned as sort of our old standby ideas in ethics around informed consent and individual rights and the sort of sanctity of the individual. Andy, any thoughts on where to go from here?
That was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much, Dr. Stonington. Really unique for our audience, but incredibly relevant and stimulating. I have a ton of questions. The first is your favorite Thai horror movie for the audience, because I know that's going to be high on people's lists. But let me ask a couple of questions that are posted here in the chat. One is coming from Professor Spector. You mentioned that removing life support in the home is considered illegal under Thai law. I was wondering if you could talk more about the intersection of law and culture in the end-of-life space, something that we struggle with in the US as well, because it also occurred to me that jamming people with embalming fluid from a tire pump on the side of the street because their pulse was low sounded a little bit extra legal as well. Would love to hear more on your thoughts on how legal expectations are limited or enabled with and by cultural practices.
Oh, Kate, that's such a good question, and I actually would love to have like an hour-long conversation with you about ethics and the law and culture. So the answer is actually it's interesting and specific in a way that I think is very telling for in an also broader way, and it has to do with the role of law in society in Thailand. And we live in the US in what I think of as a highly codified and rule-based legal system that uses both legislation and precedent as a way of clarifying sort of nearly every situation you can think of. And a lot of legal practice is spent finding the kind of interstitial spaces between the clarities made by the law in order to further hone and clarify the law for particular situations. So that is not how the legal system works in Thailand. There is very little legislation of any kind. There is almost no legislation governing the medical system at all. A lot of what happens in Thailand is policies put forth by the leading medical bodies that are just sort of like standards of practice and the way to do things. And then there is this sort of ever-present vague threat of case law, of being the first person to be sued about something. The result of a lot of this is a kind of not entirely unintentional manufactured ambiguity about what is and isn't legal. So the time I was in Thailand, there had never been a lawsuit about withdrawal of life support of any kind, and there were no clear legal guidelines from any of the advising bodies. So everything lived in this space that was, it'd be easy to say, oh, well, then the law just has nothing to say about it. It's just a set of cultural practices and people are determining what to do. But instead, it was like the law was this creepy, like infusing fog that kind of found its way everywhere as this phantom logic. Like everybody was terrified of getting sued by doing this wrong somehow, because there was no guidance about how that lawsuit would turn out. So it kind of created this increased sense of vulnerability and fear around it. At the same time, it created this wild diversity of practice. So many of the physicians that I interviewed had said, oh, I don't withdraw endotracheal tubes in the hospital because it's active euthanasia. Really clear, right? Like they created this own system for them. And then I would tell them that I was researching this and they'd say, oh, wait, what did the other doctors tell you? Are they doing it? Are they withdrawing the tubes? And what was their reasoning for it, right? Like you might be able to, if a bunch of other people were doing it differently, then maybe there'd be an accumulated kind of standard of practice that was different. And then that same doctor would, in a different context, say, oh, well, I thought this patient after extubation would be alive for quite a while because they seemed to, their RISB was good in the ICU, their sort of breathing index or whatever. And so I thought they would make it home. So that one didn't really feel quite like active euthanasia because there was going to be a little bit of a window of time between. So there was all of this kind of improvised logic that really ultimately was about how much, when you withdraw the tube, how much does it feel like the person dies right then? And there's a metaphysical explanation for that, which is that the last element of the body to separate from the spirit is the breath. And so particularly endotracheal tubes and mechanical ventilation, it's just like you pull out the tube and you just watch them not take a breath and they die. And so the sense of what is active euthanasia, what is passive euthanasia, what is a legal category that could be prosecutable or defensible, is this really gray cloud of how something feels and how it's likely to be interpreted by everybody involved.
It's truly fascinating. That could be the subject of our next Grand Rounds. And obviously the cross-cultural dynamics of that are interesting. There's a comment from Professor Spector, again, so interesting. I think the kind of ambiguity we are about to experience with writ large in the reproductive health space, where everyone is chilled for fear of ambiguous rules, is obviously relevant here as well. So thank you for sharing that. And again, that would be yet another Grand Rounds. I do want to ask a specific question that came up. I know that your fieldwork preceded the pandemic, but much of one of the many things that the pandemic stripped away from us is our ability to be with loved ones towards the end of life, with regard to visitor policies as well as restrictions. Wondering your thoughts, either anecdotal or based on chatting with folks, or just your intuition of how that played out vis-a-vis the end of life experience in the communities and the culture in which you were working in Thailand, especially related to both within the hospital where restrictions were in place, but also at home where perhaps some individuals were more or less risk averse with contact precautions and so on around folks who are sick. So any thoughts that you have in that regard would be welcome.
Wow, thank you for that super interesting question. And unfortunately, I'll give you a medium answer. The short answer is I don't really know yet. I'm leaving in 3 weeks to go back for another 6.5 months of field work in Thailand, and that'll be one of the big questions that I end up answering. Interestingly, COVID has come up a lot in my conversations with people about my next project, which is about pain management in Thailand. And just to give you a sort of quick, I'll circle back to the kind of choreographing death and with these restrictions. But right now, a big part of my project is this sense that many Thais have that that physical pain is not as existentially disruptive to people as it is to people in the United States, where pain is just this, like, lots of my chronic pain patients will talk about how the pain is just like inside their soul, and it's just like totally disrupts who they are when it's happening because it's so overwhelming. But people talk about, or at least there's a collective kind of discourse in Thailand that that's not really very true for Thai folks. But they talk about how unlike in the US, where the emergency rooms are full of people coming in who are looking for treatment for the pain that they are having a very difficult time tolerating because of how disruptive it is to them, the emergency rooms in Thailand, much more than the US, were full of people super existentially disrupted by their shortness of breath, by this sense that the inability to breathe easily was an absolute emergency. And people talk about it in the similar terms to this separating of the breath being the last stop between you and between life and death in the body, that there's something really disruptive about the disruption of shortness of breath. And people have all these different explanations for it, and that like breathing is a big part of meditating and understanding your body. And it's just like breath is a really important thing there. So already up front, just from a pure experiential phenomenological standpoint, there are these things that people are telling me are really different about the experience of COVID that are very tied to this sense of threat and danger around death and dying, that makes, even that kind of early shortness of breath that you might be able to make your way through at home if you're satting well, or if you're not, it's not progressive, et cetera, to be something that people are then going to hospitals and then being isolated from their families. So once again, COVID is like really wrapped, even for people who aren't dying, is really wrapped up in this very end of life kind of logic. And then the next thing I'll just say is that I've had a lot of people reach out to me about this book that I wrote about choreographing the end of life, but reach out to me specifically about managing COVID end of life in the United States as the first time that they've really explicitly had to grapple with the fact that part of what they're doing is choreographing this experience, and that the choreography involves these very strange uses of technology in a way that makes people's really ultimately spiritual and metaphysical end of life very dependent on the material technological world. So we get these images of people with, like, you know, the iPad, they're in the ICU and the iPad is mounted with like a family meeting and gathering for them to say goodbye for the last breaths. And these images that would have just been seemed very foreign even 2 or 3 years ago. So not so much as what's going on in Thailand, but that this concept and the way I describe all the things going on with the spirit ambulance as being actually quite helpful for understanding a little bit more of what we are now having to do around COVID end of life here. Andy, I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It just makes me excited to read your next book once you have that information. Couple more questions in the chat. I think we have time for 2 more. How does the concept of the debt of life affect societal attitudes towards abortion and laws pertaining to abortion in Thailand? And it's okay to abstain if that's not within your rubric or what you've covered, but I thought it was a question that I would pose at least.
Yeah, so I often get questions that I'm not fully able to answer because I didn't research them, are actually around the sort of beginnings of life part of this. Like, for example, what happens with young death, right? When a kid dies and their parents are taking care of them, or like teenage death. And then there's a whole set of really interesting things in Thailand around when a spirit, the different phases of a spirit really fully landing in the body. And for example, there is a set of practices of naming practices where a child is not fully named until, you know, weeks or a month into their life. And during that time, they're kind of like in this intermediary state where they're not fully present and like fused to that body, but they're not also fully absent. It's kind of like a phased joining of body and spirit. So that it's kind of like a special time when they're a little bit more connected to the metaphysical world, and they're very special. And so like Thais just absolutely love newborn babies. They're like this just super fascinating. I mean, we all love newborn babies, but also it's this very dangerous time. So like in my fieldwork, I actually had a friend who had a newborn, and then she actually tripped and fell down the stairs and had to be admitted to the hospital. And there was this whole really long, complicated conversation about whether the newborn should go and be with her in the hospital with all of that metaphysically polluted ghost world stuff there, because that it could kind of pollute and or endanger the baby in that vulnerable phase before the fusing with the body. And in that situation, they ultimately ended up deciding that breastfeeding was more important. You know, it's just like mixed in all these with, again, you're getting this sense that all this stuff is really intimately mixed together with biomedical logics. And they were talking about, this was a super medical friend of mine who was talking about breastfeeding and immunogenicity and, you know, all this stuff. So, so my sense is that abortion has a lot of that same legal ambiguity that we talked about. So abortion is officially illegal in Thailand, but again, illegal is this very confusing category. It's all about like, will you get sued and what is the content of that lawsuit? So there are lots of abortions that are performed in relatively official contexts, and it's sort of all about what are the exceptions and the justifications in that particular situation that made everybody decide, okay, we feel confident going forward with this. And it's going to be mixed with a lot of that spiritual logic about dead of life, etc. People, my sense is around childbirth and stuff, they don't talk about the dead of life all that much. It's sort of something that seems to emerge when your elders are towards the end of life. Great, these are great questions though.
Yeah, no, and there's half a dozen more that I would love to have time for, but unfortunately we are at the hour. I want to thank you so much for such an enlightening talk that really pushed the envelope of how we think about issues that we think we know a whole lot about in a really different vein. So for those who are interested, Professor Stonington hopefully will join us again in the future. His books are available, so by all means feel free to pick those up, and we'll make sure that those titles are available in the communications that we sent out as well. And I thank you for your time. I wish you all a good afternoon, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks everybody. It's great to chat with you.